Poor black girl marries 70-year-old Arab executive. 10 days later she discovers his darkest secret. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light across the dusty village. But for 12-year-old Zainab, the warmth of the sun was distant, insignificant compared to the cold weight in her chest. She stood, barefoot, inside her grandmother's small hut, wearing a tattered wedding gown that had once belonged to someone else's daughter. The white fabric clung to her thin frame, but there was no joy in it. The veil scratched at her face, and though her eyes were dry, she could feel the emptiness building up inside her. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. The women stood in hushed circles, whispering quietly, while the men turned their faces away, uncomfortable with what was about to unfold. They all knew Zainab was about to marry Mr. Faris Al-Mansur, a 70-year-old Arab man from another country, another life. A man who was almost 6 times her age, a man whose world was so far removed from hers that she might as well have been stepping onto another planet. The crowd knew the truth that Zainab's family couldn't escape. The price of her marriage would pay for her brother's medicine, food, and rent for the next year. Her family had no other choice. Her mother had sold her wedding ring, her sewing machine, and even Zainab's school books, all in a desperate attempt to save her brother's life. But nothing was enough. Faris Al-Mansur appeared 2 weeks ago, staying in a secluded lodge in the nearby mountains. His visit was a mystery. He wasn't a missionary, he wasn't a charity worker, he was a businessman, wealthy, quiet, and reserved. Rumors spread that no one knew why he was in their village. He wasn't there to help, he was there for something else. Zainab's mother had tried to refuse him at first. She shouted, she cried, she begged. But when Zainab's brother's condition worsened, there was nothing else to be done. Faris's offer was simple. He would marry Zainab, and in exchange, he would cover the treatment for her brother, and provide for the family for the next year. Her mother had broken down, and Zainab, her heart heavy, but knowing the situation was hopeless, whispered the words, "I'll do it." The ceremony was a silent affair. Her grandmother placed a thin strand of beads around Zainab's neck. Ferris stood stiffly beside her, dressed in a dark, expensive suit. His expression was unreadable, like a stranger to this land. When the elder asked him if he took Zainab as his wife, his answer was brief, yes. Zainab, her heart sinking, said nothing. There was no kiss. There was only a nod. The silence between them grew thicker. That night, Zainab found herself sitting on the edge of a pristine bed in a guest house she had never seen before. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood, but there was nothing familiar about it. Faris Al-Mansur sat across the room, his attention absorbed in a book written in a language she couldn't understand. He didn't come near her, didn't speak to her beyond handing her a bowl of soup. "You should eat," he said, his voice softer than she expected, almost gentle. Zainab took the soup, her fingers trembling as she held the bowl. She had been given food, but there was no warmth in it, no comfort. Ferris didn't sit beside her, didn't try to make conversation. He remained distant, so distant that the quiet felt even louder. Later, when nightfall came, he disappeared into the room next door, locking the door between them from his side. Zainab couldn't sleep. She stayed awake, clutching a photo of her brother. The feeling of the wedding dress on her skin felt wrong, like an uninvited guest she could not escape. As the hours passed in the cold stillness of the night, one thought pressed against Zainab's mind. What does he want from me? By morning, she still didn't have an answer. Days passed, each one unfolding like the last, quiet, unfamiliar, and strange. Ferris was polite, but there was always a wall between them. He treated her with a peculiar kind of care, as though she was precious. He brought her new clothes, soft dresses in light colors, and served her tea every afternoon at exactly 4 o'clock, with a small cookie wrapped in linen. But there was no affection in his actions, no kindness that felt genuine. It was as if she were something delicate, like glass, but not in the way someone would treat something fragile out of sympathy. Instead, it felt as though she was something valuable, an object of worth, but nothing more. Ferris never raised his voice. He never touched her. He never looked at her the way the other men in the village had looked at her, filled with lust, or pity, or both. He was different, but his indifference was just as suffocating. On the third night, Zainab couldn't stand it anymore. She had to know more. She had to understand who he really was and why he was treating her this way. As she stood by the door to the library, the faint glow of a lamp seeped under the doorframe. She hesitated for a moment, then pressed her ear to the door. Ferris was inside, like every night, sitting in his armchair, reading. But something was different this time. She saw him, not reading, but staring into a mirror on the far wall. His face looked tired, paler than usual, almost translucent. His lips trembled slightly, as though he were whispering to himself. The sight unsettled Zainab. She wasn't sure if he was speaking to himself, or perhaps to someone who wasn't there. Her heart began to race. This wasn't the man she thought she was married to. Who was he really? The next morning, Zainab found herself walking beside Ferris along the forest trail behind the lodge. He had given her a pair of boots and a scarf to protect her from the cold mountain air. His silence was heavier today, more pronounced. There was an unspoken tension between them that Zainab couldn't ignore. Ferris didn't try to engage her in conversation, and for the first time, Zainab felt like she was walking beside a stranger rather than a man who had just married her. He handed her a notebook. "You should write," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "Even if it's just your thoughts." Zainab raised an eyebrow, confused. "Right?" she asked. "Because stories make sense of things," Ferris replied simply. He paused, glancing at her with an unreadable look in his eyes. "I think you'll need that soon." Zainab's spine stiffened at his words. He spoke as though he knew something she didn't, something that chilled her to the core. Was he warning her? Did he know something about her future that she couldn't yet see? As they continued walking in silence, Zainab's thoughts raced. She couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that lingered with her, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. Later that evening, something caught her eye. It was a room at the far end of the hallway. A heavy wooden door with a brass handle that didn't turn. The room was always locked, and Ferris never mentioned it. Curiosity gnawed at her. She had learned long ago that her survival depended on learning the truth about her surroundings, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. So that night, while Ferris went into town, Zainab did what she had to do. She picked the lock. The door creaked open to reveal a room that didn't look like a normal bedroom or storage area. It was something entirely different. Zainab's heart skipped a beat as she looked around, her eyes taking in the walls lined with photographs. Each photo featured a young girl, many of them from different countries. Some were smiling, while others wore somber expressions. Beneath each photo was a date. Some dates were crossed out with an X, while others had nothing next to them. Zainab's breath caught in her throat as she scanned the room. It didn't make sense. What was this place? And why were there so many girls? So many strangers in pictures, some of them with sad eyes. Her gaze landed on a trunk in the corner of the room. She couldn't resist the urge to open it. Inside were more letters. Letters written by Ferris, each one addressed to a girl. She pulled one out and read it quietly. "Dear Amira, you're probably 17 now. I still think about you. I hope you kept your violin. I'm sorry I had to leave so soon." Zainab's hands trembled as she set it aside and pulled another letter from the trunk. This one was addressed to a girl named Chica. To Chica, "The stars were always brightest when you sang. I hope you found your mother. I hope you still sing." Zainab's heart pounded in her chest. Each letter seemed like a goodbye. A message to someone Ferris had known, someone he had cared for. But it was the last letter that made her stop. It was addressed to her, even though she hadn't seen it before. "You don't know it yet, but you will. I hope I live long enough to see you smile for real." The words on the page were a cold shock. She hadn't expected this. Why was her name here? Why had Ferris written to her before she even knew him? Suddenly, the door creaked open. Zainab froze. Ferris stood in the doorway, his expression weary but not angry. There was something else in his eyes, tiredness, sadness, maybe even regret. "I suppose it's time you knew," he said quietly. Zainab felt her breath catch in her throat. The weight of the moment hung heavily between them. She clutched the letter to her chest, her heart racing. "Knew what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ferris took a slow, deep breath before speaking again. His voice was low, as if the words he was about to say carried years of sorrow. "That I didn't marry you for me," he said, his gaze steady. "I married you for you." Zainab's world tilted. The pieces of the puzzle she hadn't even known were there began to fall into place. But the truth, when it came, was more than she could process in a single moment. Zainab stood frozen, the letter still clutched tightly in her trembling hands. Her mind raced to make sense of his words, but the shock had a tight grip on her chest. She had thought that marrying Ferris was her only choice, a desperate act for her family. But now, standing in the dimly lit room with him, she realized that her life was a much bigger puzzle than she had ever imagined. Ferris didn't move toward her, but instead, he walked over to the photos on the wall. He pointed to the image of a girl in a yellow dress, laughing under a tree full of blossoms. Her arms were spread wide, a picture of innocence and joy. "Her name was Amira," Ferris said softly. She was from Morocco. She had a stutter, but when she read poetry, you'd swear God himself was speaking through her. He paused, his voice wavering. She died at 14 from malaria. Her village had no clean water. Zainab's chest tightened. This man, this stranger who had come into her life, had a history she didn't know, a history that was far darker than she had ever imagined. Ferris continued, walking from one photo to the next, telling stories of each girl captured in the frames. This one is Leon. She came from southern China. Abandoned at birth, I paid for her surgeries. She wanted to become a nurse, but she didn't make it either. His voice was thick with regret, but it wasn't just sorrow Zainab heard, it was a deep, abiding pain, one that had haunted him for years. As he spoke, Zainab's confusion grew into something else, something more unsettling. Why did you do this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't want to hear the answer, but she had to. She needed to understand why he had married her, why he had come into her life in the way he did. Ferris looked at her with an expression Zainab couldn't place, something like weariness, something like acceptance. Because you were going to be married off anyway, he said quietly. You just didn't know it yet. Her heart dropped. His words were heavy, laden with a truth she hadn't expected. What do you mean? Ferris sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of the years was suddenly unbearable. I heard rumors, he began. A foreign businessman, a Russian, had been buying girls from families like yours. I knew about the debt your family was in. I knew the situation was getting worse. He was going to come to your mother with an offer. Zainab's knees felt weak, but she held herself steady. So you married me to stop that man from getting to me first? Ferris nodded slowly, his eyes meeting hers with an unreadable intensity. I knew I had only two choices, he continued. Let that man get to you, or get there before him. I couldn't let that happen to you, Zainab. I couldn't let you be another girl he owned. Zainab was silent for a long moment, processing his words. The truth was a jagged thing. The life she had thought she understood, the one she had accepted, was not what it seemed. Ferris had married her not out of affection or even desire, but out of a strange, self-imposed responsibility. A responsibility to protect her from a fate far worse than the one she had already endured. She swallowed hard, the bitterness of it settling deep in her throat. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? Ferris looked away, his eyes tired, filled with a history he couldn't escape. Because you wouldn't have understood. I didn't want to burden you with the truth. But you needed a choice, Zainab. I couldn't let you become just another girl sold to the highest bidder. Her heart ached, not from the sympathy she felt for Ferris but for the life she had almost lost. She had been on the brink of becoming just another statistic, a girl married off to a man who saw her as nothing more than property. And Ferris, for all his faults, had stopped that from happening. Zainab took a deep breath. She didn't know how to process everything she had just learned. Her whole life, up until this point, had been shaped by desperation, by fear, and by survival. But this was different. This was something new, something she couldn't just accept without grappling with it. Ferris, sensing her turmoil, stepped back slightly, giving her space. I didn't save you because I had to, Zainab, he said quietly. I saved you because no one else would. I've been doing this for years, saving girls like you, girls who have no one to protect them. And I couldn't let you fall through the cracks. Zainab's hands clenched into fists at her sides. No one else would save her? She had always thought she was alone, that she had to fend for herself. But Ferris's words were a lifeline thrown to her in the most unexpected of ways. Ferris continued, his voice soft but firm. I didn't marry you to own you. I married you to give you a chance. A choice. Zainab finally exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing, though the weight of the moment still held her firmly in its grasp. She had made it out of one nightmare, only to find herself in another. But Ferris had, in his own way, given her an escape from the life she had been born into. He had bought her time to make her own decisions, to find her own path. And somehow, that gave her a strength she had never known. The silence in the room was thick, suffocating. Zainab didn't know what to say. She had come to terms with the fact that her life was no longer her own, at least not in the way she had always imagined it. Her marriage to Ferris had never been a true union of love, but she had never expected it to be a rescue either. Still, the weight of his confession was like a storm breaking over her head. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Ferris stood near the door, his eyes downcast, his posture slouched as though the truth had drained him of his strength. Zainab, too, felt the heaviness of everything that had been left unsaid, everything she had just learned. Finally, she broke the silence. What happens now? She asked, her voice steady but tinged with something more, a quiet resolve. Ferris turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. Now, you decide, he said softly. You decide what kind of life you want to lead, Zainab. You have choices now, and for the first time in your life, those choices are yours. Zainab's heart twisted. Her choices. It was something she had never truly had before. She had always been pushed into decisions by the needs of her family, by the desperation of survival. But now, in this moment, she understood. Ferris wasn't asking her to love him. He was asking her to live for herself. He had given her a chance to choose a different life, a life of her own making. She glanced at the letters, at the faces in the photographs on the walls, at the trunk filled with memories. They weren't just stories, she realized. They were lives. Lives that Ferris had tried to protect in whatever way he could. She could feel his pain in the room with her. It wasn't just the sorrow of losing girls he had cared for, it was the weight of all the unspoken lives he had touched in his quest to make things right. Zainab swallowed hard. You saved me, she whispered, almost as if she were speaking to herself. But I don't know what to do with this life. Ferris stepped forward, slowly, cautiously. You'll figure it out, he said quietly. I don't expect you to have all the answers. But I'm here to help you figure it out. Zainab nodded, her hands still trembling. But this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Zainab spent the next few days walking through the lodge, her thoughts heavy, swirling in her mind like a storm that wouldn't settle. Ferris gave her space, though he continued to treat her with a quiet respect. She didn't know if she could ever forgive him for the secrets he had kept from her, for the life he had forced her into. But she knew one thing. She had her freedom now, in a way she had never had before. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the mountains, Zainab found herself standing by the window, looking out at the distant village. Her gaze traveled across the land, the same land she had once feared, the land where she had almost been sold into a future she never wanted. The village, now just a shadow in the distance, seemed different. It no longer felt like a place where she was trapped. It no longer felt like home in the way it once did. The people who had whispered about her, the same people who had once seen her as nothing more than a pawn in a game of survival, were now. She was Zainab Langston, and for the first time in her life, she had the power to shape her own destiny. Ferris had done what he could for her, but now, it was her turn. She knew what she had to do. Zainab went to the study, where Ferris's papers were spread out on the desk. She could hear his quiet footsteps behind her, but she didn't turn around. She was no longer afraid. I know what I have to do, she said softly, still looking at the papers before her. I won't waste this. I can't. Ferris was silent for a moment, and then he spoke, his voice tinged with something like pride. I never doubted you, Zainab. Without looking up, Zainab picked up the pen and began to write. Zainab's hand moved across the paper, her thoughts flowing faster than she could write. She was no longer a scared girl at the mercy of others. She was a young woman with a voice, and she had a plan, one that could change everything. The more she wrote, the clearer the path became. Ferris watched her in silence, but Zainab didn't need his approval. She didn't need anyone's approval. She had already made her decision. She had her freedom now, her future was hers to create. The next day, she began to put her plan into motion. The first step was clear. She needed to make sure no girl in this village, or any village for that matter, would ever be sold into marriage again. Zainab knew that she had the resources now. Ferris had left her everything he had. But it wasn't the money that mattered most. It was the power that came with it, the power to change the laws, to make people listen, to make a difference. Ferris had been quietly fighting a battle she didn't know about, rescuing girls from situations like hers. But now, Zainab was ready to take that fight to the world. She wasn't going to just hide behind Ferris's legacy. She was going to build her own. She called for a lawyer, a woman named Miss Barrow, who had been working closely with Ferris for years. Miss Barrow arrived with a large portfolio, the weight of the legal documents inside it a stark reminder of the responsibility Zainab now carried. There's enough money in Ferris's accounts to last you until university and beyond, Miss Barrow said, her voice gentle. But you need to decide what to do next. We need to name a legal guardian for the estate, someone to oversee the land and properties until you're of age. Zainab didn't hesitate. I don't need a guardian. I'll manage it myself. But I want something else. Miss Barrow looked at her with quiet surprise. What is it you want, Zainab? I want to use this money to help the village. I want to fix the clinic that turned us away, Build a school where girls can learn without fear, and create a system where no girl can be married off under the age of 14. I want to make sure that what happened to me, what almost happened to me, never happens again." Miss Barrow's eyes widened in disbelief, then softened with admiration. "You're not like most young women I've met, Zainab." "I'm not like most young women," Zainab replied, her voice steady and confident. "And I'm not going to wait for someone else to save me. I'm going to save the girls like me." In the weeks that followed, Zainab's plans began to take shape. She worked tirelessly, using Ferris's funds to rebuild the clinic, to repair the crumbling buildings in the village, and to create a new law, one that would protect girls from being sold into marriage before the age of 14. It was a battle, but it was a battle she was ready to fight. She met with local officials, some who were skeptical, others who were outright hostile. But Zainab didn't back down. She had learned from Ferris's quiet determination that change came not from fear, but from persistence. One day, while she sat in her office, an office now filled with papers, plans, and the determination to make a difference, a letter arrived. It was from a journalist in Lagos, curious about the young girl who had inherited a foreign businessman's estate. Zainab knew the story would spread. She knew people would question her, wonder if she was really who she said she was, wonder about the truth of her marriage to Ferris. But she didn't care. She had already stepped into the spotlight, and she was ready for whatever came next. The journalist arrived in the village a few days later. He was young, eager, and skeptical, just like Zainab had been when she first arrived at the lodge. But by the time he left, he had a story he wasn't expecting. A story of a young girl who had been saved from a life she didn't choose, and who now stood as a voice for those who had no voice. The article published in a well-known news outlet was a turning point. It spread like wildfire, and suddenly, Zainab Langston's name was on everyone's lips. The girl who had been married off at 12, the girl who had inherited a fortune, she was now a symbol of change. The article about Zainab's inheritance and the life she had escaped rippled across the world. At first, it was just whispers, a curiosity among the curious. But soon, the whispers grew into conversations, and the conversations grew into something more. People began to pay attention. She wasn't just a girl from a village, she was a symbol. She was proof that change could happen, even in the most unlikely of places. But Zainab knew that this attention came with its own set of dangers. Her name was now known beyond the village, beyond the walls of the lodge. The wealthy, the powerful, the corrupt, those who thrived on the exploitation of girls like her, would be watching her closely. They had already started making their moves behind the scenes. One afternoon, as Zainab sat in her office, the door creaked open. Miss Barrow entered with a folder in hand, her expression serious. "Zainab, there are people starting to question your legitimacy," Miss Barrow said, placing the folder on the desk. "There are whispers about the way Ferris left everything to you. Some say it's not right. Some say you don't deserve it. And there are those who would love to see you fail." Zainab looked up from the papers she was reviewing, her eyes sharp. "I'm not afraid of whispers. I'm not afraid of people questioning me. Let them, the truth is on my side." Miss Barrow hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "The truth, yes, but the fight ahead won't be easy. There are those who will stop at nothing to silence you." Zainab sat back in her chair, the weight of her responsibility sinking in. But she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every girl who had ever been trapped in a life she didn't choose. She was fighting for a future where no girl would have to make the kind of sacrifice she had. "I won't be silenced," Zainab said firmly. "I will fight, and I will win. This is just the beginning." Over the next few months, Zainab's influence continued to grow. She used Faris's legacy to build something new, a network of support for girls like her, those who had been abandoned or sold off to the highest bidder. With her newfound resources, she set up shelters for at-risk girls, providing them with a safe place to live, education, and, most importantly, hope. She used her voice to speak in places where it mattered. At conferences, on panels, and in the media, Zainab became an advocate for girls' rights. Her speeches were powerful, not because she had been saved from a life of misery, but because she spoke with the kind of truth that could not be ignored. And then, one day, she received a letter from the government, requesting her presence at a meeting. They had listened. They were ready to pass a law that would protect girls from forced marriages under the age of 14. When the day came to announce the law, Zainab stood before a crowd, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was filled with politicians, officials, and reporters, all eyes on her. She knew this moment would change everything. The law we are passing today is not just for the girls of this village, Zainab said, her voice steady and clear. It is for every girl in every corner of the world who has been sold, abandoned, or forgotten. This is for them. The room erupted into applause, but Zainab didn't let herself get lost in it. She had more work to do. This was just the first victory, but she knew that she couldn't stop now. There were more girls to save, more battles to fight, and more voices that needed to be heard. Zainab's success didn't come without a price. As her influence spread, so did the threats. Some were subtle, whispers behind closed doors, veiled attempts to discredit her. Others were more direct, and Zainab found herself receiving anonymous letters, messages that warned her to stop her campaign, to back off. But Zainab wasn't afraid. She had already been through the worst. She had survived the lies, the exploitation, and the silence. Now, she was stronger than ever, and no one could take that from her. One evening, as Zainab sat in Ferris's old library, now filled with her own books, her own plans, she took a deep breath and stared out the window. She had come so far, but there was still so much to do. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Miss Barrow. The Langston report is ready. The report, an exposé of child trafficking, forced marriages, and the corruption that enabled it, was complete. Zainab had spent months compiling evidence, speaking to survivors, and working with activists from around the world. The report would be released to the public soon, and Zainab knew it would shake the foundations of the system that had allowed so many girls to suffer. She picked up the phone and dialed Miss Barrow's number. "It's time," she said, her voice resolute. "Let's burn the dark." The release of the Langston report was met with immediate shockwaves. It was a detailed account of everything Zainab had learned about the international child marriage networks, the corrupt officials who turned a blind eye, and the ruthless individuals who profited from the suffering of vulnerable girls. The report painted a dark picture of a system that operated in the shadows, but Zainab's voice was the light that exposed it. The world took notice. News outlets picked up the story, and protests erupted in cities across the globe. Activists rallied, demanding change. But as Zainab's influence grew, so did the dangers. The very people she had exposed were now turning their attention to her. Her phone rang constantly with threats, and her every move was scrutinized. But Zainab didn't flinch. She had faced the worst of what the world could offer, and she wasn't about to back down now. In the midst of this chaos, Zainab stood tall, a beacon of hope for the countless girls whose voices had been silenced. She held a press conference to respond to the growing storm. "We cannot let fear silence us," she said, her voice unwavering. "This fight is far from over. But we will continue to rise. We will continue to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. I will not stop until every girl is free." Her words were a rallying cry, and the world listened. The storm that had been brewing for years was now a movement, a global outcry for justice. Zainab had become the face of a revolution. The months that followed were a whirlwind of legal battles, public hearings, and negotiations with governments and international organizations. Zainab's mission was no longer just about protecting girls in her village. It was about changing the laws around the world. With the help of her allies, she pushed for international legislation that would make child marriage illegal, punishable by law, and hold those responsible accountable. It was a monumental task, but Zainab had the determination and the drive to see it through. On a cold winter morning, she sat in a packed courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the day that would determine whether the laws would change or whether the corrupt systems would continue to thrive. Zainab had spent years preparing for this moment, and now, with the support of countless survivors and activists, she stood before the judges, ready to make her case. The courtroom was silent as Zainab spoke, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. "This is not just a matter of law. This is a matter of humanity," she said, her voice steady and strong. "The time for excuses is over. The time for change is now." The judges listened intently, and after what felt like an eternity, the verdict came down. The laws were changing. Child marriage would no longer be tolerated. Those who had facilitated it would face justice. Zainab felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was more than just the victory. It was the realization that her fight had not been in vain. She had changed the world for the better. As Zainab walked out of the courtroom, the weight of everything she had accomplished began to sink in. She had fought for justice, for freedom, and for the countless girls who had no voice. But now, standing in the sunlight, she felt something else: peace. The world had changed because of her, and the girls who had been trapped in darkness now had a future. Zainab stood at the threshold of a new life, not just for herself, but for the girls she had saved. She had built something strong, something that would outlast her. The shelters she had created, the schools she had built, and the laws she had helped change were all a testament to her resilience and her unwavering belief in the power of choice. She took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a leader, a symbol of hope, and a beacon for those still trapped in silence. Zainab Langston, once a poor girl with no future, had become the voice for the voiceless. And with her strength, she had rewritten the future for every girl who came after her. And as she looked out over the village, now full of hope, now full of promise, Zainab smiled. This was just the beginning. Thank you so much for watching. Your support means the world to me. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more amazing content. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on everything we have coming your way. Your feedback and comments mean so much, so feel free to share your thoughts below. Thanks again for being a part of this journey. I'm so glad you're here.